Okay, so let's jump into it. This is our Skills 1 video, constructs. Just so this one and all the rest of the semester, you'll notice inside of the HTML page in this week's folder, you'll see that you'll have the title, a tiny bit of background, links to the slides, so these ones that I'm using for later reference, and then the video. You've clearly found the video. But if you got to it from a different method, that's always inside of that web page that's labeled with what section it's on. So constructs. Constructs are a foundational piece of this semester, and it's a very broad term that will apply to lots of stuff. We will use it to we'll use it in the upcoming skills. So hammering down what this is will matter, okay? So constructs is a tricky thing to define because it applies to so many things. So I'm going to give you some definitions. You'll notice that they're not all equally useful. So I could say a construct is a non-tangible object, and you're thinking, not helpful, right? So compare it to something like a real object. So a personal characteristic could be a construct under this definition, right? Happiness could be a construct. It's not tangible. I can't grab happiness and squish it into a little ball and put it in my pocket, unfortunately. But that would make it a construct. It's not tangible per se. It could be a concept, okay? Closer, but very broad, as I said. And most importantly, the definition for this class is this third one. It's a factor that gets studied. So a construct is a technical term that can be studied, measured, made observations or generalizations about in any area of research. And we're in second language acquisition. So in second language acquisition, if I were to ask you to think of examples of constructs based on these definitions, one that could easily jump to your mind is something like proficiency, right? Proficiency, I can't grab it. It's a concept, okay, we can agree on that. Can I study proficiency? Yeah, sure. I could study what makes people's proficiency goes up. I could study what the effects of different levels of proficiency are. So proficiency is measurable, right? It's a concept within the field of second language acquisition that is measurable. So it's a construct, okay? Another one could be output, right? Production. How much let's say if I'm learning a sign language, how much I sign. I don't know sign languages, which is why I'm wiggling my hands like this. I know like a handful of signs and it's not good. Basically, I can do like different and like same and it's not good. Anyway, or so how many signs I know or how much I sign, right? That could be my output. Same with a spoken language. It could be my output could be literally how many words I say or how many full sentences I say, or my output could be very specific, like how many adjectives did I use. So output is another thing that I can't grab. It's a concept essentially, but it's something I can study. I can measure it. So it is a construct, okay? Here's a bunch of examples for later reference. Things like proficiency, input, intake, output, salience. So salience is how easy it is to perceive it, right? Something that's huge and a bright color might be very salient to most people. Whereas something that's kind of gray and blends into the background is not salient, for example. Awareness, negative evidence, which is sort of evidence that something is bad. Motivation, competence, interlanguage, all that sort of stuff, okay? You will notice our book has a glossary in the back, as we've discussed, and pretty much everything in that, short of the theories themselves, because there are theories back there, but short of the theories, pretty much everything in that glossary is a construct, because we're discussing whether it's important, how important it is, how do we measure it, etc., etc., etc. So constructs are everywhere. Okay, so constructs as measurable factors. So when we create hypotheses, which is we will do next week, they're necessarily about constructs because we're trying to measure something. So we make predictions about things we want to measure. So I'm going to give you some hypotheses, and when we talk more about them, we'll talk about forming them. But in the following hypotheses, I want you to try watching this video, pausing, whatever you got to do, to identify the constructs, okay? So number one, quantity of input affects score on a proficiency test. Type of feedback. So when you're talking, I could give you feedback like, that's wrong, or I could just make a face, right? Or hold up a red card. Type of feedback affects likelihood of uptake. Now, uptake is whether you change your output in reaction to feedback. So if you, for example, are trying to speak English and you say, John walked to the store, and I go, walks? Maybe you're more likely to go, yeah, John walks to the store. Or so uptake would be, I incorporate that correction, right? And then motivation and context of learning are related. Context is something like classroom versus natural environments or something like that. Okay, so for example, if you're looking for constructs in number 1, input is measurable. Proficiency is measurable. So they are the constructs in number 1, right? Quantity, literally a measurement of how much input. Score on a proficiency test. So when we talk about measures or tests when we're doing studies, those are usually, they're tests of something, tests of the construct, in this case, proficiency. Okay, either pause or using your eyeballs, take a look at number 2. Which ones are the constructs? Okay, they are feedback and uptake. So type of feedback, right? So my variable, so my operational, the way I define that variable is this, or that, right? Feedback could be I repeat it with the correction, I tell you it's wrong, or I just make a face, right? So that's a construct that has various ways to do it, measurements. Likelihood here, the likelihood of uptake, that's also a construct because I can measure it. Did it happen or didn't it? Did you make a correction or not? Similarly, glance at number 3. Okay, constructs. Okay. In this case, it's motivation. Do I have it? Do I have a lot of it? What type do I have? Construct. And context. Context A, context B, context C. Measurable. Ergo, it is a construct. Okay. I slipped a second ago and said the word operationalization, which is a mouthful. Operationalization. Operationalization. But what it means, operationalization, is how we define a variable. So here you'll see the claim, when we design experiments using constructs, right? So if I'm designing an experiment about proficiency, for example, that construct, proficiency, must be what we call operationalized, which is to say, defining the way in which it's measured. So proficiency could be, I could operationalize it as performance on a test. I could operationalize it as native, non-native if I wanted. In the case here, we have the construct temperature, and I want you to think, how many ways could I operationalize temperature? Okay, which means if you don't understand what I've said so far, hopefully your experience with temperature will help you understand. Okay, so temperature, we could do Celsius, we could do Fahrenheit, we could do Kelvin. There are different ways to measure temperature, right? The scales are different. So if I operationalize it one way, in Celsius, you're going to get this number. If I operationalize it in Fahrenheit, it's a different number. If I operationalize it in Kelvin, it's a whole different number, right? So, for example, 0 degrees Celsius is 32 Fahrenheit, and I forget Kelvin, right? Negative something. No, hang on. No, it will be negative. It's like 200 and something. Anyway, Kelvin, look it up. Kelvin, 0 Kelvin is no motion in the molecule, right? It's when nothing has any vibrations. So everything is based on 0. So the scale starts way down on the edge and moves its way up. Doesn't matter. You can Google it. But so temperature can be measured at least 3 ways, at least. And you're going to get different numbers depending on what you choose. The same is true of constructs in SLA, right? If I measure proficiency in terms of native and non-native, I'm going to group together a ton of people that are everything from I can't make a sentence up to I sound like I'm native, because technically speaking, you're non-native. And so if I define it that way, native and non-native, you're going to be grouped with the people who, again, can't make sentences, right? So how you operationalize will very, very much affect how your experiment rolls. Okay, so here you see the 3 things that we talked about earlier. Number 2 and number 3 we're going to do in class, but I'm going to talk through number 1. We kind of talked about proficiency already, but let's do it, okay? It's an operationalization of the constructs and following examples. So let's do number 1 together, okay? Quantity of input affects score on a proficiency test. Now, I can operationalize quantity of input various ways. So input, again, if we haven't totally absorbed this yet, input is the amount of like language use in your environment. It can be, sign language is very visual, auditory or reading or something if it's a spoken written language, etc. Ergo, it's your exposed language, right? And so quantity of input could be how many hours a day you spend in an environment that uses that language. That is an operationalization of quantity, right? Or it could be how many books you've read, or how many videos you've watched, or how many songs you've listened to. Quantity can be defined in many ways. It could be defined in years, right? How many years did you live in a family that used this, right? So imagine we're doing people who know multiple languages because their family knows them. So going back to heritage learners, it could be how many years did you live in that family? So if your family spoke it at home and then you left home at 18 years, that's an operationalization of quantity, for example. Now, proficiency, I've already given you two proficiency tests like this one. Proficiency can also be, like I said, native, non-native. People sometimes do proficiency using like a naming task, right? Like a picture naming task where I show you a picture of a frog and then I measure how long it takes you to say frog and how accurate you are. There are proficiency tests based on that, and surprisingly, the results are pretty reliable. Surprisingly, especially at lower levels of proficiency. So there's lots of kinds of proficiency tests, right? I could just a priori say native, non-native, which isn't a test, so it doesn't work as well for this particular hypothesis. But it is an operationalization of proficiency. In this case where I say test could be my picture naming task. It could be like a multiple choice. It could be like a written exam where I go back and go, look at this person's sentences, or I look at their mean length of utterance kind of stuff, or proficiency test could be oral, proficiency test could be signed. It could be lots of things, right? And so it really will affect how that study gets put together, and to some degree your results, depending on how you make the operationalization. Going back to the native, non-native operationalization, you're going to get a lot of variety in your L2 group's results if you just make non-native the entire proficiency measure, right? So it's going to matter, okay? And so we will talk about 2 and 3 in class together, but this is the idea of what we're doing, okay? All right, just to kind of take away, since there's so many things that could be said about this, I'm going to tell you for this particular one, what exactly do you need to always to be able to do? Now you'll see here there's some basic stuff, and then sometimes things under advanced. So things that you should always be able to do with respect to constructs. Explain what the term construct means, what is the idea, what is a construct, and operationalization. When I say explain, I do not mean give me examples, because you can memorize examples and not understand what you're doing. So you need to be able to tell me a construct is a measurable thing, right? It's a factor that we can study in an experiment. And operationalization is, of course, how we use that, right? It's the method in which we do that measuring. Other things you have to be able to do are identify them when you're reading. So in an actual hypothesis like we did, or in an abstract, which is like the summary of the study you see at the beginning of an article, or in an entire article maybe, right? There'll be constructs that will sometimes only appear that, like a hypothesis will have like 2. The abstract might have, let's say, 4. An article may actually have 15, right? We're not doing whole articles per se in this class. We'll have some sample writings, but not like full articles. But this is the idea, is that when I give you a piece of writing, I need you to be able to go, I think this one's a construct, okay? And then identify when someone's telling you an operationalization. So if I say the group was X and Y, you go, operationalization. Or if I say we use a proficiency measure, you go, operationalization, okay? These are things you need to be able to do in this class. Absolutely need to do, okay? Now, sometimes, this is the advanced part, so if you have enough context, enough practice, and I've constructed the question in such a way that this is reasonable, I would expect you to be able to propose what constructs are relevant to a research question, right? And in some cases, they might not already be in there, maybe, right? But in general, to kind of have that sort of creative piece, propose what might be relevant, right? So if I'm talking about proficiency, you might go, hey, maybe fluency matters, right? Or if I'm talking about proficiency, you could say, hey, what about motivation, right? Those kinds of things. So in some very limited contexts, I would expect sometimes that you'll have those kinds of opinions. And so on a very basic level, start thinking about how to operationalize things, as we had done today, and we will do some more in the future. Okay, so these are the things that I would expect to see as far as constructs are concerned, but these will keep reappearing throughout the semester, and you'll probably only get better at them. So, all right, see you in class.